We did hear from the Honorable Deputy Minister that the sector certainly produces around 1.3 trillion. That is a lot. And so we do know that the arts and entertainment sector makes a significant cultural and social significance. But I do want to address something besides that point, which is what is the underlying condition and reasoning, and maybe perhaps even philosophically, why we are only doing this after 32 years right now. And I would say this is the same thing globally, as this was the conversation there. And I would first ask, we have artists and cultural professionals here. How many of you, by show of hands, have been ridiculed for getting into this profession? Exactly. So at least every one of you had a conversation where, particularly from our support systems, where either your profession or your work is treated with indifference or at worst with derision. And so they in itself, we need to look at what does professional mean, what does a worker mean, and why do we not have these rights realized? And I think as a community, this sort of idea not only permeates through our families and our leaders and our governments, but globally too. And this is, I think, the very reason why we are only having this conversation right now. And yet, during the pandemic, this was exposed. We've all heard everybody say this was exposed. It is not that the pandemic had caused it, but it rather highlighted, or let's say, rather had an impact on the nature of the sector as it is. And so I'll not repeat much of what was already said, but the technical meeting made specific recommendations and conclusions, around 20 of them. I will not discuss all of them because we will not leave here. They are very detailed. But we do have a report that is actually written, and if you are so interested, you can look at that. And the document itself, or ILO, is also available on their site, specifically regarding social protection and decent work. And so the technical meeting culminated in this and come to the conclusion of specifically this major conclusion. But I will take you through others. The first one indeed is the role and importance of the arts and entertainment sector. It does provide economic and social cohesion, and it certainly is part of a democratic state. And if you are going to speak about a democracy, you have to speak about the basic standard of living for every single citizen. And the individual, that is the creative or the artist, has specifically been excluded from this, from the definitions, from the nature of work, from basic conditions. And so that is a very important conclusion. So we started with that. We had to agree. And I think most important of those discussions was, I think we all fundamentally agree what are the issues. I think maybe there were concerns about how we would go about fixing those issues or strategies that we put in place. And so second conclusion is the transformation that we are going through right now, that of digital nature and also of unforeseen circumstances that just happen like this. We need to plan for those things. And so that is a very important part of that. But fragility indeed defines the sector. We are fragmented, and unlike most sectors or industries, the creative and cultural sector has sub-sectors, and each one of them has its own nature and its own way of carrying out the activities. And so we need to, at the same time as we are transforming our law, look at, are we just going to put them in one pot? But that's not the case. A theatre worker is not the same as a visual artist. And so we need to look at these specific differentiations. Again, decent work. Now you cannot have decent work without social protection. It is built into it. They in fact follow each other. If you speak of decent work, you necessarily mean that there is indeed social protection, that there is social assistance and social schemes, insurance as the differentiations made by Mr. Sam here. And so decent work deficits still persist, and it has largely to do with the informal nature of the industry. And so we need to look at those things too. So the challenge here is not only social protection, which has to do with more social security aspects of things, but also the specific labor standards that we have put for ourselves for all other industries and have agreed to in an international level. And they have to do with adequate remuneration. We do not have a basic minimum wage. We do not have, of course, social protection. We indeed enjoy a less discriminatory country. As Patrick was pointing out, we are quite global leaders in the work we are doing right here, right now. And our society is not particularly the pointing or the ridiculing kind in that way that would deny or hinder the artistic freedom that each individual can enjoy as a professional. And so then you go on to the working condition itself. One of our panelists spoke about space, environment. That in itself is part of labor standards. We have to consider those too. But I have to be very fast because Mr. Amoka also has to say a few things, so I'll leave specific labor law issues to him. And so, of course, we are dealing with the issue of the nature of the work. So, under the Labor Act of 2005, there are different sections. There are working hours, there are basic conditions, and then there are issues of union and issues of dispute resolution. None of that is applicable to the professional of the artist kind. And so we cannot, in good conscience, apply the same working hours or definitions. Oh my goodness, this happened already. Okay, so they are all these sort of type of works, and there is this diverse nature of the work. And so there are specific recommendations that were given besides the conclusions. I call them develop, invest, enhance, support, and prioritize. So, of course, with development, it has to look at the regulatory framework. Investment has to look at the institutions that fund the arts and cultural sector, as the National Arts Council or the Namibian Film Commission, etc. And then you have to enhance, which means whilst we have basic conditions, there needs to be entrepreneurial support. Because as we spoke about, there is a nature of the work that is sort of self-employed, which means you have to hustle for yourself. And so you need to have those sort of basic skills as to do your own books, write your invoice, be able to navigate marketing, and even how you deal with your team if you are a team of artists, those relationships there. As far as the opportunities and challenges are concerned, I'm going to leave those for the panel discussion because those are specifically the gaps that we will speak about. And so, let me quickly, but I can go through them. There is an informal nature, which is a challenge. We also have limited funding issues. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, income insecurity, precarious work, and access to infrastructure and resources. With the AI opportunities, of course, all of you sitting here are inspired by the Caribbean diversity and cultural heritage. The creative industry certainly can make use of digital transformation. We are embarking on an AI revolution that in itself should raise questions about labor protection, because there will be many of the artists that will be displaced. There are already trade unions around the world going on protests and part of collective bargaining negotiations to make sure that there is some form of protection of their work and not that of AI. And even if you do use AI, how that would look as far as intellectual property is concerned, what sort of concessions which you make about your rights. Again, strategies, these are part of the solutions that I will also discuss. So the main and the most important one here is the conversation was really, the theme is the future. And we were looking at harnessing the fullest employment potential of the arts and entertainment sector to ensure future work is inclusive, sustainable, and resilient. So I must stress at this juncture that at the technical meeting, social dialogue and collective bargaining was the thing we kept coming back to talking about. And I think most of the panel members also brought that up. You cannot have social protection if you do not start with the social dialogue. And then from the social dialogue comes collective bargaining. And so, therefore, you need to start having, as we are doing now, this is a social dialogue. We have all the industry important stakeholders here, and this is an important conversation, and I'm very grateful for that, because we have been, since we came back, trying to get these recommendations implemented insofar as it is the first step, because you can't go to 12, we need to start at social dialogue. And so that is a very important method to address sector-specific needs amongst this world of transformation. And again, ensuring decent work has to do with social dialogue. We need to speak about it, and we need to address all the specific characteristics of this industry. So there are different strategies as to harness this full potential. One of them is indeed social protection. We have gone through exactly what social protection means. It means creating a national legal policy and framework, both through social security and through labor laws. And then secondly, to provide the government with a roadmap, which is typically your regulations that would actually state how in practice this would look like. And yes, do I have a little bit more time? Okay.
Well, you've come so far.
All right. Thank you. I think I will just run through the strategies quickly because I'll address them again. Arts and entertainment education is very important. Sustainable jobs. How do you sustain jobs when your basic needs are not met? So if we are thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, no one moves to the next step of, for example, investing back into your own your product if you do not have shelter and food, if you do not know how to get around. So that is very important. Support of entrepreneurship, again, for you as the professional to have all the skills necessary. Of course, you do not need to do everything, but to have basic understanding of things is always a good thing. And then indeed to foster creative communities, this is a measure of collaboration between stakeholders and even private partners. Another one is indeed private partnership, and lastly is the digital infrastructure. Now this one is a big one because it is what we are currently living through, but most of our infrastructure hasn't been transformed into digital. We spoke about databases not being there. We spoke about many people, besides those in the central of Windhoek, around all of Namibia, do not have access to all the tools we may have here in Windhoek. So these are all the matters we have to look at, because we want to get to inclusive, sustainable, resilient. So I think this one is, the most important one. Again, highlighted the significance of collective bargaining as the fundamental mechanism for safeguarding the rights and welfare of artists and creative workers. The meeting recognized the potential that collective bargaining has to ensure fair wages, improve working conditions, and access to social protection. Considering the unique nature of the industry, we do need an equally sui generis approach, an innovative approach. We cannot force the definition of employee into that of the individuals of the sector, as it does not fit the traditional method of or definitions. We cannot address working conditions if we're going to force it into the existing labor law. I like to always think about what has been done with the domestic workers. Of course, there are certain chapters, certain basic principles that have to be referred back to the 2007 Labor Act. But before that, we can sort out in its own sort of law the nature of the industry and what employment relationships mean in that industry. And so the role of social protection, rather collective bargaining, is also important in dealing with the power imbalances that happen between someone commissioned to do a work and that, well, you can't say employer, but the commissioner basically. There are these, you have to negotiate your prices, and most times, because there are no basic wage standards, you can, to be quite literal, shoot yourself in the foot. And so, yes. So, formalization of the industry is dependent on artists exercising their freedom of association. You cannot, we were speaking of compulsory, voluntary, and maybe both, but our constitution is very clear about the nature of what a freedom means. It is voluntary. We cannot force, although we can maybe force people to do social security or comply with the labor laws, we cannot certainly force them to be part of a union. But it is your freedom. And the problem is, if you do not exercise it, you will not get these sort of favorable conditions for your industry. And so collective bargaining is very, very necessary to the trade unions, because you have to come and negotiate. The ILO will not, they are the watchdogs when there are industrial working and labor negotiations. They cannot simply sit with the government and the employers, potentially like the NTN or the Namibian Film Commission, without the employees, typically in this sense, because you all have to agree on the conditions. So you cannot start collective bargaining without the artists coming together. And so this conversation here is really largely to urge the artists. As was already said by a trade union representative, we can only bring the information, only make you realize what your rights are. But that is it. Rights, regardless of recognition, hold little value if they are not realized or exercised. Thank you.